Hello everyone, it's Cameo. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about what books I read in October. I read a total of 8 books this month, and that's a really high number for me. I think that it's partly because some of them are quite short, and also one of them is an audiobook and I just listened to it while I was walking around. I had a pretty good reading month. I really enjoyed most of the books that I read. Some of them were just okay, but I didn't dislike any of them really. So all in all, it's been a pretty good month. I'll just go through the books that I read in the order that I read them. The first book that I read, or rather finished in October, was Mariana by Monica Dickens. This book is published by Persephone Books, and it was written and set in the 1930s. It's sort of a coming-of-age story about a girl named Mary as she grows up in London and goes to a theatre school and studies dressmaking in Paris, and then finds herself back in England and basically looking for the right man in her life. But it's quite a literary book as well, and though it's slow and doesn't have a lot of action happening in it, I did find it to be really engaging. And I think that the publisher describes it as a hot water bottle novel, so it is a really good kind of comforting, slow read, and I would really recommend it. The second book that I read was The Book Collector. I also had this one out from the library, so I don't have a copy to show you. This is a historical fiction book set in, I'd say, in the Victorian period or the early 20th century maybe. It follows a woman named Violet as she meets a man in London who's a bookseller, or a book collector rather, and the next thing you know, they're married, they're living out in the countryside, and they have a small child together. Violet's quite happy with her life there, but odd things start to happen to her. She finds a book of fairy tales locked away in a safe in her husband's office, and he forbids her to look at it or even go into the library anymore. And also, women are disappearing from the local asylum, and Violet starts to question the way that she's viewing the world, her sanity basically, and it kind of takes off from there. I enjoyed this book on an intellectual level. I think it engaged with themes that I'm quite interested in. I liked the literary subtext of the fairy tales, and I liked the topic of women's mental health and how that was treated historically, especially in relation to gender oppression. But it sort of felt like there was something lacking for me in this book. I actually think that maybe I wanted it to be just a little bit longer so that we could get a bit more of a grasp on the setting and the characters. But I also think that maybe that wouldn't be very suited to the fairy tale style of the book. But I just don't think that I've liked it as much as some other people that I've seen reviewing it on BookTube. So that was kind of unfortunate, but I think that it would be a really interesting book to read if you're interested in those themes. The third book that I read, and this was on my e-reader, so I don't have a physical copy to show you, was Witches of Lychford by Paul Cornell. This book is set in the modern day in a village in England, and it follows 3 women as they fight to stop a large supermarket chain from building a branch in their town, because by doing so, the boundary between our world and the supernatural realm would be broken and all hell would break loose, basically. So it is a fantasy novel. I think that these 3 women are sort of meant to represent the triple goddess of neo-paganism. They're kind of, all 3 of them discover that they're witches. One of them already knows that she's a witch, and she's this old woman who I think is meant to be sort of a crone figure, and she's a really interesting character. I quite enjoyed reading about her. Another woman is a minister in a church, and I think that she's more of a mother figure, even though she's a young woman still. And the third woman runs a sort of new age shop in the town, and she's a bit of a an outcast really, and I think maybe she's supposed to be like the maiden figure. I enjoyed this book for what it was. It was really a novella actually. It was very short. It was quite engaging, but I do feel like it was too short to be sort of substantial. I didn't get a very good sense of the setting, for example, which I think is kind of important given the plot. I wasn't surprised when I got to the end of the book and I learned in the author's bio that the author is actually a screenwriter for TV shows, because I did feel like it was a similar experience to watching an episode of TV. It felt very compact and had about that level of depth to it in terms of characterization. And I think that maybe that's why the setting was a little bit underdeveloped, because I don't think that's something that screenwriters have to focus as much of their attention on. I don't know if I would continue on reading this series, but you never know. The fourth book that I read was The Dream Thieves by Maggie Stiefvater, and I listened to this one as an audiobook, so I don't have a physical copy to show you. This is quite unusual that I only have a few physical books to show you, because I usually read everything in physical format. I think that this was a pretty good book. I listened to the first one on audiobook as well and quite enjoyed that. I feel like I can never really get the same reading experience listening to it as physically reading it, because I usually listen to audiobooks when I'm walking around and I'm kind of a distracted person, so I'm constantly having to go back to re-listen to what I've missed. But I do think that these books are very well written. You probably know what they're about because they're very popular, but they're a young adult series called The Raven Cycle, I think, and this is the second book in that series. The series follows 4 young people, a girl and 3 boys, as one of the boys is trying to locate the body, I guess, of a Welsh king. The second book follows one of the other boys named Ronan, who in the first book I think was actually quite a flat character, but I think that I enjoyed seeing the way that he was developed in this book. We really got a sense of why he acts the way that he does, and this book kind of explores an ability that he has that is revealed at the beginning of this book. I think that these books are quite well written. The characterization is really good. The writing itself is really good. I think that the characters feel really real, which is what I'm looking for in young adult books. I feel like I've had quite bad luck with young adults lately and over the last few years, to be honest. I don't really read very much of it, maybe that's why. So I would recommend that one if you like young adult and if it sounds interesting to you. The fifth book that I read, and this was also on my e-reader, was The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. You might see a theme here. I was trying to find the perfect spooky read for October. I really enjoyed this one. It's kind of a classic haunted house type story. It follows a woman named Eleanor who is invited to a place called Hill House by a man who is writing a book on the paranormal, I guess, and he has invited several people to stay at Hill House, which is notoriously haunted, and he's going to record what happens there for his book. Eleanor is a really interesting character. I should have anticipated this having read We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, which is also narrated by a very interesting young woman who has a very unique perspective on the world, and I think that Eleanor also has a very unique perspective. She makes for quite an unreliable narrator, which I think is the perfect style of narration for a haunted house story, because you don't really know where to draw the line between what is actually happening and how Eleanor is interpreting the situation. And I think that there are a lot of other interesting elements to do with female sexuality and also maybe social anxiety that are explored in this book. I really enjoyed this while I was reading it, and I've been thinking a lot about it since I finished it. I would like to read it again, maybe in a physical copy, because I always find that for some reason I am less engaged by books that I read on my e-reader. I think that I'm just a kind of tactile person, and it lessens that experience for me. But I would really recommend this book. It's very psychological. It has a lot of really interesting characters, and the setting is quite amazing. The next book that I finished was The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. I talked about this in my Finally Fall tag. This was probably my favorite read of the month. It was the perfect sort of gothic spooky novel that I was looking for to read in October. As I said in my Finally Fall video, this is a historical fiction novel set in post-war England in the 1940s, and it follows a doctor who is called out to an old estate home, and he becomes sort of entangled with the family who lives there, and increasingly scary, spooky things start to happen at the house. I've heard a lot of people say that this is slower than her other books and could be a bit shorter, but I actually really liked the length of this. I don't think that the slower sections where not a lot was happening plot-wise were at all unnecessary to the book. I think that they were very necessary for our understanding of the characters, and I think it was the perfect length. Yeah, I really loved this book, and I can't wait to read more Sarah Waters. The next book that I read was The Outrun by Amy Liptrot, and this was just lovely. I think that this was an amazing book. It is a memoir and nature writing book that follows the author's struggle with alcoholism. She's born in Orkney, and when she's a young woman, she moves to London to sort of escape that small island environment, and she kind of is living a party lifestyle and finds eventually that she has a problem with drinking. So she comes to terms with her alcoholism and gets help for it, and ultimately moves back to Orkney in order to kind of come to terms with her new sober lifestyle, and she feels to maintain her personality when she is not drinking. And these are really the nature writing aspects of the book. It's almost like she replaces her engagement with nature with her previous engagement with alcohol and her sort of social life in London. And I really appreciated the way that she writes about technology, for example. I think that in a lot of nature writing you have really unnecessary artificial juxtaposition between technology and nature. And in this book, she really talks about how technological she is as a person. She's always on the internet, and she ends up using technology to understand the world around her. She tracks planes and satellites and planets, and I think that was just really interesting, and I really appreciated that aspect of this book. The writing was just beautiful. I think that this was actually shortlisted or maybe won some literary prizes, and I'm not at all surprised about that. So I would really recommend this one if you're interested in any of these topics or these genres. The last book that I read, I actually feel kind of lukewarm about, and that was A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This is a fantasy novel about parallel Londons. There's our London that doesn't have any magic, and then there's a red London that has a sort of balanced magic throughout, and a white London where magic is quite rare and people are fighting over it, so it's very violent. And then there's a black London where magic got out of control and it kind of doesn't exist anymore and has been shut off from the other Londons. And this follows a man named Kel, who is one of few people who can move between Londons, so he's a kind of messenger figure between several worlds. And it also follows a girl named Lila, who is a pickpocket from our London, which is called Grey London, and she crosses paths with Kel and they go on adventures together. The book seems to be set in, I'd say, the Regency period, because it starts off with Kel visiting King George III while he is quite sort of senile and his son is the Prince Regent. And that seems to be sort of roughly the time period this book is set in. I don't actually think that that comes into it at all, because the other Londons are so different from Grey London. And to be honest, I think that that setting is kind of rather arbitrary. It doesn't really play into the book at all. I think that some aspects of this book were quite good, and then other parts of it were quite bad. So it kind of just evened out to an okay read. The thing that I liked most about this was the setting. It was quite interesting. I quite liked reading about Red London, for example, but none of the settings are as fully fleshed out as I would like them to be. The characterization in this book is not very good. I felt like the characters were really two-dimensional, and I didn't really understand their motives or why they were acting the way that they were beyond really simple motivations, I guess. But I have heard that the second book in this series really turns that around. I think that the weakest part of this book was actually the plot. I think that it was quite predictable and the pacing was a little bit off. And to be honest, the reason why I pick up a book like this is kind of to be engaged by the plot, so I think it was a bit of a letdown in that regard. However, I think that I wouldn't mind continuing on to the second one in the series, because I've heard it is quite a lot better than the first one. But I don't know that I would really recommend this to somebody, because it was just sort of okay for me. So those are the books that I read in October. I think I had a really good reading month, actually. I enjoyed a lot of these books, and I'm really thrilled that I read so much, because normally I read probably half this amount. I would love to talk about any of these books if you have thoughts on them in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to subscribe or like this video, and I'll see you all again next time. Bye!